I want to share with you a passage from Isaiah, which is a very famous passage, but if you read it, you'll be amazed at how much there is in there. How do you turn pages and hold it at the same time? It's a skill. This is Isaiah chapter 6, and this is the calling of Isaiah. And I think many people are familiar with this passage, and it's something that we need to meditate on, because every time a prophet in the Bible, every time a prophet in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, speaks to the people, there's a scene where God specifically called them. And I think that those are not written down just so they could share it with their grandchildren. I think it's written down because we need to think about the idea of calling and what it means to be a people who are called. And this passage, if you read through it, every verse has something that will challenge you about what it means to be called. I want to read, first of all, the opening section where it talks about the majesty of God, and then I want to skip ahead a bit to a part where it talks about numbness. So first, the majesty of God. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty. The hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, and each had 6 wings, and with 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew, and one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots of the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the whole house filled with smoke. It's this magnificent picture of what the glory of God is, as Isaiah saw it in that time. And I'm going to skip ahead a few verses to verse 8, which is the moment of calling. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us? And I said, Here I am. This is Isaiah speaking. Send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears, and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed. And then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate. Until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. What a horrifying vision. This people is going to be numb, and the land is going to be destroyed, and through that whole process, they're going to be numb to what's happening. When it says King Uzziah, King Uzziah was one of the last great kings of Israel, and he was king during a time when Israel was incredibly wealthy. The Bible talks about the magnificence of Solomon. He built this pleasure palace, and he brought the tabernacle of Moses into Jerusalem and built a temple for it, and he had 1,000 wives, and he had concubines, and he had slaves. He introduced the practice of slavery into Israel. And if you look at the wealth that it describes, and then you look at the archaeological history of Palestine, there's a lot of wealth around that time. They got really affluent. And I think that it's really significant to us when we read that it's a moment in time when they'd come to the end of a long period of affluence, much like we are experiencing in the world at the moment, with everything that's happening with the global financial crisis, and we came through the 80s and the 90s, and greed was good, and everyone was investing, and eventually it began to crash. After King Uzziah died, there was never a moment really of peace again in Israel for a long time, because that affluence had come out of the fact that Egypt had really fallen, and there wasn't much oppression in the world at the time. But when King Uzziah died, everyone kind of knew that it was all over, because there had been this menacing empire in the north called Assyria that had been rising. And at the moment that King Uzziah dies, the last protection is beginning to fall. Now, does this remind you a little bit of what you see sometimes on the news at the moment? We've gone through this long period of prosperity. But different forces are rising in the world, and the prosperity is about to go. And here are people who are so comfortable living in an affluent society. Now, there's an Old Testament scholar and theologian called Walter Brueggemann, who suggests that there were 3 factors in what was happening in Israel at the time. And the first thing was an economy of affluence, which is described by everything that King Solomon set up. and all of the riches that they had in Israel. But the other thing was a religion of immanence. When the children of Israel had fled from Egypt, everything they say about God is holiness, is greatness, is majesty. But as you read later and later, they start to become very comfortable and easy with God. And there is an assumption that, look, whatever I'm doing, God's just there anyway. You know, I don't really have to come before God and repent, and I don't need to pray. I can just assume that God's going to show up what I'm doing in my life. And Walter Brueggemann says that when you have that affluence in society, it's very easy just to walk into that familiarity with God and say, hey, we've got a lot of everything. We've got everything we need, and God's here. You know, I really loved what Jay was saying the other day about how we find the last Diet Coke and we're like, yeah, that's just Jesus left that there for me. That's pretty cool. Because when you're not experiencing all of the things that are going on in the world, when you're not experiencing the sadness and the difficulties, you're like, yeah, God's just set everything up for me so I can walk through it and it'll be a piece of cake. We do things like we just say grace at the beginning of a meal for 30 seconds, and we're like, all of this food is blessed. You know, this food that was probably, comes from slaves. Slaves that come from the third world, this food that, probably is destroying the environment. Let's just say grace over it, right? We say a prayer before we go to bed, maybe. It's really easy with God. It's almost like a magic spell. And I hear this a lot in churches at the moment, that you have to put aside this tithe, this tenth of your income, because that will sanctify everything else that you have. You know, however wealthy you are, however much you are exploiting other people in the way that you live, however much damage you're doing to the world, you put a tenth of that aside, and all the rest of it is just blessed. It's just covered. This is how the economics of affluence feeds into a religion of familiarity with God that results in the third part of the equation, which is a politics of oppression. Because whenever one person is affluent, whenever one person is finding it easy, there's someone else who's bearing the cost. You know, all this stuff that we see all around us all the time, and we're like, where did this come from? Where did that come from? It didn't just come out of thin air. We could not live in a way that is this comfortable and a way that is this easy if it wasn't for the reality of oppression in the world. And we see that, but we try to ignore it. People who have had their voices taken away from them, because when they speak out and they say what that truth is, everyone thinks this person is rocking the boat and upsetting the status quo, which God has blessed. I know that because I got my Diet Coke this morning, which everything is easy. If I have to hear that voice, then that messes everything up. That messes up my relationship with God, and I don't want to hear you, so you need to keep quiet. And then we start talking about harassment. I don't want to have to hear that. I don't want to have to deal with that. That's your problem. That's not mine. So we live now in a society where the almighty kings of Israel have really been replaced with our almighty economy and our almighty parliament and the almighty dollar and freedom and everything Jay was talking about. But those dynamics, just as much as they were in the time of Isaiah, are still active today. And we need to have this vision of God sitting on the throne. Because if you're going to undo that, then I don't believe you just start with the oppression. Sometimes we attack there in the place of politics. I believe you have to start at the level of affluence and the level of the easiness and the familiarity we have with God. We need to confront God sitting on the throne, because that religion of awe and transcendence and passion enables you to become a prophetic voice. And that's what's happening when Isaiah is called. He's being transformed into a prophetic voice so that he can speak out against the oppression that's happening in his world, because people are too easy with God and they're too easy with their own affluence. And that's what I believe is the church's role in this numbed out world, is to be a prophetic voice, much like Isaiah was. We live in this numbed out state, firstly because we need to protect ourselves, because people experience trauma. And we go into this instinctive way of hiding from the bad feelings, hiding from the exhaustion. But over time, it comes into a way of upholding the status quo. Because when every voice is silenced out, and when I'm not in touch with my negative feelings, then I just keep working in the way that this society says I have to work. And the money keeps rolling in, and the prayers keep going up. Hallelujah, Jesus. And we just keep on the system, and everything runs like clockwork. We do it in that way. We also do it by these outlets that are placed all around us in the world. Because those feelings are down there inside us. You know, we see something on the news and it says, that's not right. So where am I going to put that? What am I going to do with that? I'm going to outlet that into my coffee break, and I'm going to outlet that into my medication. I'm going to outlet that into all these different places. So we're in this situation, but it's not going to work. It's not going to last for long, because deep down we have this longing to know what the reality is. There's this picture, an Australian cartoonist from Melbourne called Lunig, and there's this man just watching the TV, and there's sunrise is on his TV, and then sunrise is coming through the window, and he's smiling at the TV. And that's what we're like. But that sunrise that's hanging out the window, that reality, that's haunting us. We know that it's there, and we want to know it deep down inside. But we also know that you can't opt in and opt out of different emotions. We want that majesty of God, we want that glory, we want that passion, the joy, the love, and we want all of these things. But the thing about numbness is it blocks them all out. And you can call up a service line, and if you press 1, you get one operator. If you press 2, you get the other. You can block out the options that you don't like. But when it comes to your heart, when it comes to what God is doing in your life, you've got to take the pain and the joy together. So here's the challenge for us, is that we're in a safe place of being numbed, and we're in a world that numbs us down, and we have these options before us. God's incredible plan for our lives, the purpose that God has given us, a passion for the world, and then alongside it is the pain. And it's a package deal. Are we going to face up to that pain? Are we going to look at what it is that has been tearing us apart? Are we going to go through a process of allowing God to reveal that to us and then receive the joy? Or are we going to stay in our carefully protected bubble and miss out on all of those things that God has for us because we're afraid of piercing through that numbness? And I want to reiterate again that when I say piercing the numbness, when I say finding a way to prophetically challenge that, I am not talking about snapping out of it. That is not the way to deal with it. And if we snap out of it, we can traumatize ourselves even more. What we need to do is to enter into a process of coming to terms with these emotions. We need to be part of a community where people care for each other, and there's safety to do it, where people want to listen, where people don't just want to hear the good things, when people are willing to hear the bad things, and when there are people who can stand up and be that prophetic voice while you're not in a place yet where you're ready to do it, and you need to be hanging out and healing for a little while and prayed for. But a community that does stand up to injustices in the world, a community that does declare the glory and the majesty of God, then we're in a place where we can begin to heal, because we need a community that replaces the affluence of our society, that puts different things in place. As long as we're out there in the world, we're constantly being drawn back into that. And the church needs to be a place where we can step into, where it's actually safe to be different, where we don't have these rules, no one's allowed to harass me, I don't want to see anyone's negative side, where we're actually able to engage. So, after Isaiah prophesied for the next 150 years, the history of Palestine is just one of agony and grief. Assyria grew and it swept away the northern tribes of Israel. And then Assyria eventually fell, as empires do, and Babylon rose. And Babylon had a different policy. It came in, it didn't destroy the people. It took their leaders captive, took them to Babylon and put their own leaders in place there. And it also broke down the temple, because they saw that as being something that would challenge their empire. And after 150 years, there's Jeremiah, the prophet who inherited the mantle that Isaiah had originally had. He's standing in the middle of a people who have completely been destroyed. And we have the Lamentations of Jeremiah. We have this grief that he talks about. And he articulates that grief in the middle of a people who are so numb, who haven't snapped out of their affluence and their easiness yet, and are just still living in that fuzzy place, and they're letting these empires wash over them and destroy them.